I just want to unpack the prompt. Some of you may have read the prompt, does God exist? But of course, that prompt has specific bullet points that you might have seen. It is a little bit more tight and specific than that. So, does a God exist who meets the following criteria? Creator. A God is the author of the world's design and order. A personal God. God has qualities including love, compassion, and reciprocity that enable God to have personal relationships. Providential. God can interact with the world to bring about desired ends, such as miracles like the resurrection of Jesus. Sufficiently powerful. God has sufficient power to create the world and providentially care for it. Sufficiently knowledgeable. God has sufficient knowledge to create the world and providentially care for it. And finally, universally loving. God loves the entire created order, including its individual creatures, expressing a consistent commitment to their well-being. So some of these questions are part of that theodicy debate, if you've heard that term. So these are the specific criteria included under that broad banner, does God exist?
So it's my privilege to introduce one of our debaters. David Coppola has served in teaching and administrative positions in high schools and colleges for 40 years. He wrote his dissertation on moral leadership and has written articles and books on education, interreligious dialogue, leadership, and youth issues, and has spoken at hundreds of days of renewal for teachers and church groups.
All right, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ryan McLaughlin. Dr. McLaughlin has published 2 books on Christian theology and non-human animals, one of which I'm happy to say I've read, and it's quite interesting and thought-provoking, and even created a discussion with my 13-year-old son who loves animals, and it was quite great. So Dr. McLaughlin is an associate fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He's also written over 20 articles and book chapters on topics including environmental ethics, biblical studies, feminist hermeneutics, and the problem of evil. He's currently working on a book entitled The Guilt of God, A Dissonant Theodicy, which I just learned about when I got the bio. So good luck on that. Excellent.
So before we continue any further, I just want to reiterate the aim and spirit of the debate. So this is not a competition to see who's right or who wins, and it's more a process of rigorous intellectual inquiry, an exploration of ideas that both speakers have deeply examined. This is really a time-honored tradition of both sharing and deepening knowledge and fostering mutual understanding.
All right. So, when this event was being organized, Dr. McLaughlin said, many students here haven't seen a debate, and I hadn't thought about that before. So you should really think about the debate and the content, but remember at once you're witnessing a debate on the existence of God and a debate, right? So you're witnessing a debate, meaning a conversation between 2 people with different points of view, and you have, heard that term debate, but you might not know its forms. So you'll learn some of the process and its forms in addition to the content of this particular debate. So after today, you'll see the function of its being adversarial, meaning, there's some opposing parries and thrusts and people making different arguments and counter-arguments. And it's not about triumphing or either side winning, but by having that adversarial nature in a friendly debate like the one we have on offer, you should learn something of the truth. And I like the term dialectical, and it's sort of a little bit different than a debate. It's when, 2 people are coming together with the goal of coming to a greater approximation of the truth, and I think that's probably the spirit of this debate.
Okay. I now give the floor to David for his opening statement.
Great, thanks. Thanks for coming today. Appreciate your presence and your willingness to grow in understanding and to grow in your own journey towards wisdom. My journey's been long. I'm happy to say I've been many different places and visited the East, worked in Africa. But today we're just going to talk about the West, all right? Because there's only 10 minutes, or now 9.5 minutes, to talk about 25 centuries. But I'm not going to fill it like that. So our time today is, I hope, we'll be able to come together in such a way that it's meaningful for you and not just a drama. I'm a little too old for drama, so I'm looking for some kind of meaningful conversation. Because there are about 40 or 50 descriptions over the past, like I said, 25 centuries that seek to demonstrate the existence of God. I'm just going to choose a couple from a classic source. Maybe you've heard of St. Thomas Aquinas, 13th century philosopher, teacher, Dominican, and he has some ways. He has 5 particular ways. We're not going to go through all of them because each one could take an hour in themselves. But I'll try to summarize them. And then moving from the abstract more to the historical, I'll suggest a couple ways in the scriptures of which I'm aware. So I'm involved in interreligious dialogue in the Abrahamic faith, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I'll stay mostly with Christianity. So full disclosure, I'm a believer. Dun, 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 dun. No, all right, forget it. You know, the monkeys. So whatever I share with you, that the proposition I share has been, challenged and critiqued. And this dialogue over the decades, over the centuries, has been called the Great Conversation. And it is. It's a great conversation because it can bring meaning to our lives, but it's modeled, as our moderators were suggesting, on the philosopher Plato, who died in 348, 350 in Athens, and this idea of having a dialogue. Okay, so here we go. And the first way that St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican priest and teacher, who died in 1270, is we look at the things around us. So all of our knowledge is analogous, right? We compare things. That's how we learn things. We compare one thing to another. And if we look around us, it seems that everything is changing. And it's being changed by something else. And so the way that this thinking goes, if the change agent, okay, the person or the thing, is itself changing, then it is also being changed by something else. But there can't be an infinite chain all the way back, so there must be something that causes that change. And so, in another hour, I could tell you the basic idea is Aquinas is teaching his young Dominicans, who believe in God, by the way, that God is this kind of unmoved mover, this unchanged doer, if you will. And that has its advantages and its issues. But that's an abstract kind of conception of God. The second way that he suggests is that it's not possible for something to be the cause of itself. Like everything, we look around, everything is caused, right, by something else. Everything exists because something else caused it into existence. So, for example, he talks about in the Summa Theologia that plant growth depends on sunlight and water, right? So obviously. But it also depends on the right environment and is governed by more fundamental causes, if you will. And so Aquinas is basically, proposing that there must have been some kind of first cause, because something that exists could not have not existed except for maybe that which at his time in history called God. And so the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, is not a suggestion that it goes all the way back to just one Big Bang, which is a more contemporary term, but is such that God is the primal cause, the primal mover, the first, if you will. And by the way, Aquinas was not trying to defend God, and neither am I, by the way, okay? It was more an illustration. If we use, by the way, you have to come to the place that our intelligence is somewhat reliable and that we can discern things and we can grow in our understanding. If you don't trust the minds, well, then I don't know what you're doing here, okay? But at the same time, we should be skeptical about that which we can learn and that which we can know, because we're finite, right? We're limited. How can a finite being and creature understand the infinite? And that will be a continuous kind of critique throughout the centuries. And so, there are several others. And by the way, I have kind of like a leave behind as you as you go out that describes each of the ways, if you will, because I don't expect you to know these things unless you've studied them. But there's one other kind of point that I think suggests a way for us, is that what is our meaning and our purpose? Like, what's our end? What are we destined for? Can we tell just through human reason? And Aquinas suggests in his kind of fifth way, he said, just like acorns usually develop into oak trees and not into lions, right? Have you seen an acorn develop into a lion lately? No, of course not. Okay, well, he said the oak tree is the end towards which the acorn points. It's the disposition, towards maturity. And so he suggests, what do we point to? What do we seem to end towards, if you will? So those are kind of some like abstract conceptions, but they don't get us anywhere near, or as near as we probably want to go, with a God who is personal and who cares and is involved in our lives. And so for those kinds of understandings, those kind of 5 ways or other ways, there are many, I turn to the distilled wisdom of the tradition of Judaism and Christianity in particular. And you have, if you're a part of that tradition, they call a Bible. And the foundational event was the Exodus event. And you can read it in the Bible. It happened around, 1270 BC, maybe 1440, we're not sure exactly. But it's an event that had a whole series of events that were a part of it. And at the end of it, this group of people, the Apirus, the Hebrews said, wow, somebody up there likes us. Somebody up there is on our side. Through the Red Sea, on the other side, they formed a community. They agreed on values. We call them the 10 Commandments. They made a covenant with God, an agreement with God. How am I doing? 1 minute left? 2 minutes. Okay, good. I'm almost around here. And so that Exodus event led to the creation of a people and an articulation of God. And throughout their history, there were judges and kings and teachers and prophets and all the different ways that God was revealed to that community. They wrote these things down. And then eventually they wrote down, several sources wrote down the book of Genesis. And I know you think the book of Genesis is written first and somebody was there taking notes when God said, let there be lights. But it wasn't quite like that, okay? It was more the distillation of wisdom, and it was one of the last books written in the Old Testament that is meant to be a cipher, like kind of a key, kind of points to what's about to come in the Jewish scriptures. That God, there is a God, this God communicates, this God acts, we're like this God. And so the bridge then eventually, at least for Christians, between the finite and the infinite comes in the Jesus event. And Yeshua bar Joseph, so Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary, became a human being. And he was revealed to be God's son, God. And through his life, teachings, deeds, death, and resurrection, revealed God's self to us. And so with those kinds of confluences, we end up with a final kind of reality, if you call it whatever you want, but there's a Christian community, and there's this Holy Spirit that calls us to act in a certain way towards others. And the classical articulation of that is, there it is called the corporal works of mercy found in Matthew 25. Oh, you didn't hear the bell, did you? I can hear it up here. It's like, but more to come, no doubt.
Okay, so we're going to transition, giving the floor to Dr. McLaughlin, and 10 minutes as well.
Turned on. Okay. All right. Thank you to St. Elizabeth University for hosting this event. President Crosby, Provost Bartlett, BPA Bartlett, the Cabinet, the Board of Trustees. Thank you, Stephen and Carla, for moderating. Thank you, David, for joining me and for that excellent opening statement in this, what you call the great conversation. It's good to be a part of it. All right, I have some slides because I'm a visual person, and also I get lost way too easily if I don't have something to follow. So we're debating whether a very specific God exists. A God who has the qualities and characteristics that our moderators expressed fairly well in the introduction. And so in this debate, just to clarify, when I say God, I'm referring to this particular God, and this is going to be distinct from deities like Odin or Spinoza's impersonal necessary substance. We're talking about a very specific God here, and we want to keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to put my cards on the table right away. I don't think we can logically prove that God exists. I also don't think we can logically prove that God doesn't exist. So for me, this debate is about weighing the best evidence for God's presence against the best evidence for God's absence and determining which is more probable. Let me see if I can make better sense of this by considering Santa Claus. And spoiler alert, if for some unholy reason you've brought a young child to this debate, please remove them for the next few moments. I just don't want to be responsible for this. Santa enthusiasts might say, we should believe that Santa exists because every Christmas morning there are gifts under the tree for children. That's evidence. A Santa skeptic might reply, however, that's not evidence for Santa's existence. The parents or guardians put those gifts there. And here, the Santa skeptic has challenged the evidence supporting Santa's presence. There's a little pun there, but just ignore it. But the skeptic might continue by presenting evidence for Santa's absence, and it might look like this. If Santa did exist, we'd expect all good children to receive gifts on Christmas, but many don't. This suggests Santa doesn't exist. And this is evidence, this is not just a challenge to the evidence of Santa's presence, it's evidence of his absence. And you can see Santa is getting more upset as we go on, so let's leave it behind. The point is, when it comes to God, which is weightier? The evidence of God's presence or the evidence of God's absence? And here's my position. The best evidence for God's presence is not overly convincing. And there's some damningly convincing evidence of God's absence. So it makes the most sense to conclude that the God we're talking about in this debate probably doesn't exist. Now, my focus in this opening argument is the evidence of God's absence. What is this evidence? Another way of asking this question is there anything about our world that, like good children not receiving gifts in the Santa example, strikes us as surprising or unexpected if God did exist? And I think the answer is yes. Let me explain why. The world is finely tuned. I know, and David's like, that seems like evidence in support of God's existence. But give me a minute. I accept that the universe is, in fact, finely tuned for life like ours. There are many values, including the gravitational constant, the cosmological constant, the mass of protons and neutrons, to name only a few, that must be in a very specific proportion in order to one another in order for a universe and for life like ours to emerge. I accept that. But that's only part of the story. We don't just have a universe that makes life possible. We have a universe that makes tremendous suffering inevitable should life like ours arise. Let me give a few examples. In a world like ours, diseases like cancer are inevitable. They're a natural byproduct of the mechanisms of biological evolution, including random genetic mutations, as well as cell growth and repair in genes. In a world like ours, predation, in which one creature eats another creature, often while the other is still alive, is inevitable. So is parasitism, where one organism lives at the expense of the other's well-being, often killing it in the process in painful ways. These strategies are immensely successful, and computer simulations run by scientists such as David Penny and others have demonstrated that in a world with features like ours, predation and parasitism will inevitably follow when life arises. In a world like ours, natural disasters are inevitable. Given the fundamental laws of physics, planetary dynamics, and geological processes that govern our universe, there are going to be phenomena such as hurricanes and earthquakes. I could go on because there's a longer list, but that's enough for now. But let me point out, none of these features exist because humans made bad choices. The free will defense doesn't work here. Humans can and do make things like disease worse. But we're not the reason cancer and earthquakes happen in the first place. They're built into the fabric of the universe, natural byproducts of the way our world works. So, if our universe is designed, it was designed such that cancer, predation, parasitism, and natural disasters, all of which cause immense amounts of suffering, would inevitably occur, often affecting the most vulnerable creatures. To put this in a way that may be more rhetorically effective, our universe isn't just finely tuned for life. It's finely tuned for the suffering and death of the most vulnerable lives, including innocent children. Why is this claim important? 2 reasons. First, we're claiming that God loves all God's creatures. But if God created this world, it necessarily follows that God created a world in which an unthinkable number of innocent creatures would inevitably, unwillingly, and disproportionately experience tremendous suffering. I've already explained why this suffering is inevitable. Let me unpack the other ideas. I say these creatures are innocent because in the case of non-human animals and human children and many human adults, they haven't done anything to deserve getting a disease, being eaten alive, being infected and torn apart from the inside by a parasite, or being buried alive in the rubble from an earthquake. I say they suffer unwillingly because they didn't choose to be created. If God created the world, God decided that this unthinkable number of creatures would inevitably suffer and didn't take their will into account. I say they suffer disproportionately because it's not as if we all get an equal or fair share of suffering. One child dies young from bone cancer, another gets buried alive in a mudslide, yet another grows old in good health. And a lot of that's just dumb luck. Like some kids not getting gifts on Christmas in the Santa example, I think this random distribution of immense, inevitable suffering is profoundly surprising if a God who loves all creatures created the world. At first glance, it's substantial evidence of God's absence. A few minutes, thank you. But it gets worse. It's like an infomercial now. But wait, there's more. Our prompt also states that God is sufficiently powerful to intercede in the world to do specific tasks, including resurrecting Jesus from the dead. God can intervene effectively enough that God can raise a particular Jewish man from first century Palestine from the dead days after he died. I think I know just enough about biology and neuroscience to say that's quite an impressive feat. But God doesn't help the suffering creatures, human and non-human alike, when they are suffering because of the world God has created. God lets them suffer. God lets them die. God raised Jesus from the dead, but allowed over 1 million children to die torturous deaths under the Nazis. God raised Jesus from the dead, but allowed over 99% of all species that have ever existed to go extinct. God raised Jesus from the dead, but has allowed billions of animals and humans to suffer and die because of disease, predation, parasitism, and natural disasters. This leads to the second reason my claim that our world is finely tuned for tremendous suffering is important. If God created this world, then God created a world in which an unthinkable number of innocent, unwilling creatures would inevitably experience tremendous suffering, knowing that God would be either unwilling or unable to help them in any effective way. This is also really unexpected if the God we're debating today exists. Now, maybe God can't help them, but if God can't help them, why create a world in which their suffering is inevitable? It's also odd to think that God couldn't help them if God could raise Jesus from the dead. Maybe God chooses not to help them because there's some greater reason to allow their suffering. I'll address this point later. I just will say now, I haven't found a good reason to let a child die from cancer yet. My main point is this: the history of life on earth is littered with the corpses of the victims of God's good creation. If the God of our prompt created this world and loved us all, we wouldn't expect this to be the case. That it is the case is very strong evidence of God's absence. Unless the believer in this God can outweigh this evidence of God's absence with stronger evidence of God's presence, or explain why a loving God would create a world with such unexpected outcomes, it makes the most sense to say this God probably doesn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin, for your opening statement. And now we're going to move into the rebuttals. So I'm going to ask Professor David. I'm going to ask David to join us.
Okay, all right. So, of course, my colleague is choosing the most difficult question in all of theology, okay, and in all of philosophy for that matter. It's called theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do seemingly bad things happen at all? Why couldn't God just create everything to be lovely? Why isn't it just like the Garden of Eden? We're all childlike. We know nothing. We're happy. We're well fed. We're provided for. And this is the conundrum. And throughout, again, the tradition, at least the tradition of which I'm a part of, the rabbis have taught for millennia that when a child dies, God cries. That's not an answer, but it is a response in relationship. Mm-hmm. In other words, the God of the Israelites and later of the Christians and presumably Muslims, God is involved in this world without interfering. And so why would that be? And the way that the logic of it is, one answer is, God's ways are not my ways, blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay, that's not really part of this conversation. That's Job. You know, poor Job got beaten up like you can't believe it, and read it sometime. Maybe not. It's depressing. But anyway, at the end of the day, he just says, I don't get it, but I know God's God and I'm me, and blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, we're not really here today to talk about that so much. The one of several other possible ways of exploring theodicy has been, at least in the Jewish tradition, bad things happen when good people do nothing. Now, more to Ryan's point, there are some things that happen to people that they didn't ask for, that didn't get caused, or whatever, that they did not deserve. And notice that's all from our point of view, again, from a human perspective. But if the highest calling is love and life, and we can debate what love means and what life means, of course, but if the highest calling is love, then there must be an environment of freedom for love to exist. If I force you to love me, that's not love. If I force you to be good, that's not goodness. If I force you to tell the truth, well, then you're just telling the truth for fear of being persecuted. If I enforce what I think is beautiful, then how do you really know from your soul, if you will, or from your heart of hearts, what is beautiful? And so in order for love and goodness and unity and truth and beauty to flourish, this is the classical language that Platonists often use, but Aquinas as well as Maimonides used it, then there must be an environment of freedom so that humans have a choice. Now notice, this is anthropomorphic, anthrocentric, if you will, and I think it's a good point. We're more and more attuned to our responsibility to all God's creatures. And so this is a relatively new part of the conversation, I got to tell you. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation, but basically the King James Version of the Bible said, be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth, and subject all the creatures to your will, if you will. The rabbis teach, now, actually that translation wasn't so great. It's not about having dominion over all the fishes in the sea and the birds of the air, etc. It's really having responsibility for all other life that we are a part of. And so as a result, I think the conversation is changing, and our awareness and our understanding is changing of what it means to be fully human and be a fully human participant in creation. But I do know this, that unless we have a choice, our purpose and authenticity is at stake. So just like today, I am and Ryan, we're not here to impose our positions on you. We're here to propose them. And we hope that through these propositions, you continue in your journey of faith and it brings you to a place of life and life-giving. So I didn't necessarily rebut you, but I did expand at least how the argument goes in theological circles. There you go. All right, next.
Thank you so
you're
much.
up. Okay, sorry.
Well, I'm just passing on the baton here now we are still in the rebuttal stage, and if Ryan, you will go ahead, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you, David.
Sure.
Wonderful thoughts. Thank you. So I'm going to respond primarily to things David said in his opening argument here, and then in the cross-examination we can get into some of the stuff from the rebuttal. Just a few points here that stood out to me, I think, as interesting from the opening statement. The arguments that David had raised, Aquinas' arguments from causation, from movement, and then the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, I think these are all really interesting. I think he makes a good point, and I agree with him that those don't get us to the specific God of our prompt. They might get us to something we might call God, but they don't necessarily have to get us there. So even if I say everything that that comes into existence has a cause, well, the question is, what is that cause? I could say that cause is God, but it's not clear to me that I have to say that cause is God. I just have to say it's something other than what that thing is, right? And so long as we can't have an infinite regression of causes, well, we could also then ask, well, what causes God, right? Unless God is the exception to the rule, but then someone has to make the case of why God is the exception to the rule and why something else can't be the exception to the rule. So the person who believes in God has to make that case in order for that argument to stand. But it's also interesting that when, David, you had mentioned that Aquinas says, things cannot be their own cause. I find this really interesting when people who believe in God say this, because they tend also to believe in the concept of free will. Now, if I ask, what causes a free action to happen? Well, if something causes it, what is it not?
Yes.
It's not a free action if it's caused. If it's caused by the agent, what causes the agent to choose that action? If we really stick strongly to this argument of causation, it seems like we start to lose free will. If we abandon the argument from causation, then the argument from causation doesn't seem like it applies to God as well either, to this argument for God. So I don't know that those arguments are super helpful. I don't know that they get us even to a point where God is more probable than not. This is all speaking of evidence of God's presence, just to clarify. The Exodus example is really, really interesting. I love the Bible. I just want to get that out there. I'm a scholar, a student of the Bible. I just want to highlight a few things. The Exodus event is amazing from a particular perspective. A few things I just want to remind people about the Exodus event. When the Israelites said, somebody up there likes us, that was after 400 years of slavery, right. Where somebody up there apparently ignored them. When the Israelites said, somebody up there likes us, that was after God had sent an angel to kill the firstborn children of the Egyptians. Not the Egyptians who were causing the atrocities, the children of the Egyptians. So even though these narratives do present us with an idea of there's a personal God out there who loves us or who likes us, it's not a universal love, and there's usually problems that come along with that, right? So I think the Exodus has wonderful imageries of being like liberation from slavery and all that kind of stuff, but you can't ignore the other sides of that coin. That the liberation of slavery comes with the murdering of children. The liberation of slavery comes with 400 years of silence in the face of slavery. All of these are problematic as well. So once we start to look at those things, I think some of those arguments don't have as much weight. And that leads then to the question of, can we refute the argument that God has allowed, or not just allowed, but caused these negative things to, how am I doing? 1 minute? 1.5? That has allowed these negative things to happen in the world. And David had mentioned free will, that you can't force love. And I completely agree, you cannot force love. But there's a distinction between saying, I cannot force love, and I'm going to create a world in which cancer is inevitable. I mean, those are distinct things, right? I don't force my child to love me because I want him to choose to love me. But I'm also not going to throw him into a situation in where cancer is inevitable for him, right? I would actually consider that an unloving act. So yes, love might require the ability to have free will. By the way, I don't know how that works with heaven. Are we going to be free to not love God once we get to heaven? But that's a separate conversation. Could there be a Holocaust in heaven? I don't know. But at bare minimum, the question of free will only gets us so far. It doesn't explain cancer. It doesn't explain natural disasters. It doesn't explain the kinds of inevitable harms that I raised in my initial point. So I don't know how far free will gets us. And the sort of astounding thing about all that is these things that murder us, the cancer in a child, takes away their free will. So for all of God's love of free will so we can choose to love God, God has created a world in which many children will never get that chance. And that seems, again, profoundly surprising.
Thank you, Ryan. So we're going to move in from the rebuttal phase to the cross-examination phase, and I'll hand it over now to David.
All right, how long is that, just so we know?
5
Oh,
minutes.
that's long, too, okay, well.
Ask away.
What's that?
Ask away.
Well, so it's fortunately, as colleagues, we know what's going on here. There's like, for every sentence he says, there's a century behind it.
Yes,
You know what I mean? So
yeah.
it's difficult to know exactly where to come in. But I think the most important thing for me is in our conversations, we necessarily take a human perspective.
Right.
Because we can't see from God's perspective, assuming or not assuming, if there is a God. I mean, I presume there is. Mm-hmm. And so that which we may ascribe to God often, not always, but often is human intervention as well. Mm-hmm. And plenty of people who believe in God have done naughty things, and plenty of people who don't believe in God have done great things. So it's not just a matter of belief, but what I think Ryan adds to this conversation that's important is the perspective of ethics. Intuitively, you're saying what's fair, what's right, what's just, okay? And what is the best? And this is human nature. We constantly try to push in our understanding and in our actions, what is the best, the most virtuous? What is the good, Plato called it? What is the good that we want to achieve? And again, when we as finite creatures try to push this onto God, if you will, we really don't know, right? I mean, that which we know is through revelation, is what God has revealed in the person of Jesus or through the prophets of Moses, etc. And is revelation reliable for you? In other words, can people teach us things that are important? Can people teach us things that are truthful? You ever heard of an electron, a gluon? I suspect in the 4th grade you heard about it, but you never saw one. Oh, but I saw the effects of it. Oh, interesting. You saw the effects of it. Okay. Did you ever see the wind? More colloquial terminology. You don't have to go to, atomic the atomic dance. You ever see the wind? Well, not exactly, but you feel it. You see its effects, right? And so there are some things that we kind of make the jump. We go from, at least with God, we go from analogy, comparison, to anagogy. That's one of those fancy words, godliness, if you will. So where is the point where we come up against the barrier, where we can't cross over? Where God is God and we are not. And that is the journey. That's ultimately the journey. And I appreciate what you're getting at. What's fair? Or what's just? Because if God is a God of love, then what's just? Right? What's fair? And so this is the invitation then for us, or whoever, for humans to say, what am I going to do about it? How much time? 1 minute. Yeah. So I was a teenager. I was 17 years old, and a boy I knew in high school, he decided to go swimming in the Rockaway River, which is not far from here, after it had been raining for about 2 weeks. He drowned. He died. And we couldn't find him for 3 days. And I remember thinking, what the heck? And at his funeral mass, I went to it, and the music was more amazing than I had ever heard it before, because apparently Francis was studying to be a priest, and I didn't know that in high school, you know. And I kept saying, why? This isn't fair. He had so much going for him. And the only intuitive answer I could get or receive, and for the last 40 years, is, what are you going to do about it? That's called the existential approach, okay, just for the record, okay? I didn't just go off on some little story. I mean, that's it. So what am I going to do about it? What are we going to do about it?
There we go. Now we would like to invite Ryan in for his cross-examination.
Yeah, so I think there's actually a lot that I think David and I would agree with. And the first is that existential.
If there's anything, that's great.
Yeah.
No, only kidding.
I think the existential point that, discussing the problem of evil is, I think, an important thing to do and discuss. But I think the question, what do you do in the face of evil, is an immensely important question. And I think it doesn't do us any good to say, well, where is God, if we're not doing anything either. So I think that is an immensely important point, and I think we are both agree on that. I want to address quickly, and maybe even ask you, 3 points that sort of have been made and how they fit together. So I want to clarify something first about what I'm saying. My position isn't just about justice. It's what we would expect our world to look like if God were good and just. That's really the crux of my position. And is this the world we would expect, or is this world unexpected under the proposition a good, loving God who is sufficiently powerful and all that kind of stuff exists? I'm saying it's profoundly unexpected. Therefore, it seems more probable that this God does not exist. Okay. Now, the limits of human perspective. Yes. This is something that I have learned over and over again when I have, from my feminist teachers, from my phenomenological teachers in philosophy, that I have a limited perspective. I am biased, and I'm constantly bringing that to the table. And all humans have a limited, finite perspective. But I want to balance this with something David said in his opening argument in defense of his arguments in favor of God, and that says, intelligence is somewhat reliable. So we have to balance, on the one hand, my finite human perspective with the claim that intelligence is somewhat reliable. Okay, once I go to there, I can start saying, how do I, given the best evidence available to me, navigate this question? And to me, this is the real crux of the matter. What does the best evidence tell me? And how do I sort of navigate that? And in this case, I think the best evidence suggests this God probably doesn't exist. And I'll use the wind as an example. Right. Because when David says, have you seen, you've not seen the wind, but you felt its effects. Granted. But when the wind is a hurricane destroying everything in its path, the last thing that I'm going to say is, well, that wind probably loves us all. Right? So I mean, even if something is out there that exists, we're not just talking about existence. We're talking about existence that is predicated upon power, knowledge, providence, and love. And so we can see the effects of God, not just in good, but in things like cancer. And this is problematic. This is counter-evidence. This is evidence of absence. So if I say, does the wind exist? Absolutely. Does the wind love me? No. Right?
Sometimes.
Yes. The wind seems indifferent to my well-being. That would be my thought, because sometimes it's good to me, sometimes it's bad to me. That seems to be my experience of God as well. So I guess, David, my question to you then would be, do you think the nature of our world, given the claims about the inevitability of cancer, do you think it's possible, or not, I guess possible, do you think it's probable that God has a good reason for creating a world in which so many creatures inevitably suffer such tremendous hardships? Do you think that's probable, that God did that on purpose and that there's a good reason for it?
I think it's part of the self-limiting principle of love. So you must have freedom in order to love, and so therefore God, in a sense, has to self-limit to allow certain things to happen for the ideal of love to flourish.
And you think something like cancer would be necessary for that?
Not necessary, but
an inevitable
possible.
outcome of a process.
Possible. Yeah, it's one of the things that are possible. But I also don't think it's done. I also think that the universe is unfolding and continues to be redeemed, healed, whatever. And much of that is what the Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin suggested, you know. So this and other philosophers, as you know, Alfred North Whitehead, et cetera, there are people who say we are part of the movement of God.
Yeah. So just one follow-up, and then I know I'm out of time. You said possible.
What do you mean? I yield some time to him. Come on.
You said you think cancer is possible. But my point is that it's inevitable, given the structure of our universe.
You mean inevitable at least once? I see what you're saying.
Inevitable as a feature of our universe.
I don't think it's a primary feature.
Okay, but its inevitability still would be the case of making.
As is death, yes.
Yes, as is death. But you think that would be acceptable of a good God?
Well, I don't think we say, why do we die? Because if we lived forever, then every choice we make would be meaningless. Because I could just, if I get in a fight with you, I could just wait a couple thousand years and make up, you know? So what's the point in that, you know? So there's a certain amount of inevitability that comes with death and how death is experienced because of freedom, the environment of freedom, I think. I mean, that's how I get at it. I mean,
and you think of cancer the same way?
I think cancer is similar.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But I don't think that God zaps people.
Yes.
Like, I don't think God intervenes in that way.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on. Before questions, of course, we'll have that at the very end, but we're going to go from cross-examination to closing arguments.
Oh, closing,
so
okay.
I'm going to yield the floor to David for 3 minutes.
Okay, well, I thought my closing argument would just, it's not really an argument, would be keep asking the questions. It's more of a plea, okay? Because we just did 25 centuries in a half an hour, and so I hope that you've gotten some thoughts and that you will, you know, keep thinking this through. But there was a poet, and by the way, the artists and the poets and the musicians have got a way of getting to this as well that is beyond philosophy and theology. But Rainer Maria Rilke, you know, said, live the questions now, and perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into an answer. So it's not just the answers, it's the questions that are important. And the way that I come to that in this conversation is from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, the one who knocks, the door will be opened. And then it's a fascinating thing, it kind of ties in what we were talking about before. Which of you would hand his child a stone if he asks for a loaf of bread, or a snake when he asks for a fish? And if we who are wicked know how to give good gifts to our children, how much more will our heavenly God give good things to those who ask? So there's a promise in Rabbi Jesus, in Jesus the Christ, in Yeshua Jesus, that things may not be perfect now, but there is the promise that the God of Jesus and the God of Christianity, is inviting us to a better life, is inviting us to a redeemed life, is inviting us to life to the fullest.
Now we would like to invite Ryan into his closing argument.
I'm going to get a little weird for my closing argument. Sorry. I want you to imagine you are playing a video game, or you are aware of a new video game that came out. And has anyone ever played a Sims game before? A Sims game is where you there's little people and they're programmed and you can make. But this is a new Sims game, and in this Sims game, the programming is so sophisticated that the characters are conscious, like you and I, and they believe that they actually exist in a world. So if you make a world in this sim game, they're going to be like you and I in this world, thinking that we exist. Maybe that's what we are. Let's leave that aside for a moment, okay? Now, let's say you believe for some reason, you probably don't at this point, but let's say you believe at some reason that I'm a profoundly good person, all right? And you also know that I've created a sim world. And I say, you want to come see my sim world? And you're like, yeah, I'd love to come see your sim world. And in my sim world, you are very surprised to find that all of my sims, or the majority of my sims, are dying because they're eating one another. They're dying because they're being buried alive from my programming of natural disasters. They're immensely riddled with disease, and they're killing each other through genocide. And you look at me and you say, what you doing? I'm like, I'm creating a good world. In fact, it's very good. Are you surprised by my sim world if you believe I'm a good person? I think you would be. I think you would say, why did you make that world? That's the same exact reasoning, the same exact reaction we should have against God looking at this world. Why this world? Why not a different one? And if I told you this is the only world I could think to make, you would probably say, just don't make one then. Just don't make one. Just leave it be. The fact that this world is so profoundly surprising in terms of its suffering, in terms of its hardships, right? In terms of the inevitability of its hardships and its suffering, suggests to me that God is either indifferent to us as individual creatures, or has a much greater good in mind that does not take account of our individual well-being. And I cannot reconcile that with the idea that God loves us all and seeks our well-being as individuals. Just like you would consider me to be a not wholly good person if I created that sim world, it seems more probable to me to suggest that God is not wholly good, even if God does exist, because God created this world.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean,
Sit down, Steve.
but you see how complex and also how meaningful and ethical this kind of a conversation is. And I think it gets us right back to what you affirmed before, that what I suggested and what you affirmed, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
What is our place in this? I mean, and Jesus, Rabbi Jesus, Jesus Christ.
Whom I like.
Okay, me too. Clearly, what we call traditionally in the Catholic world, it's Catholic University, so why not, right? Called the Corporal Works of Mercy. Basically says, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. A stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me. These are the ways to make it better, right? These are the ways that we can co-create or co-redeem with God. Not become God, but to also make a difference. What are we going to do about it? And so that's one of the Gospels, Matthew
25.
Yeah, I know.
We're there.
I got it. I mostly studied Old Testament, but I know some of the Gospels too.
Excellent.
And I just wanted to clarify that I think there are some things we cannot answer, right? There are some things that are mysteries, but we don't let them go. We keep asking the questions. We keep trying to discern what the Holy Spirit is calling us to. Okay, sorry, I talked too much.
No, thank you. So now we're going to move on to our Q&A session. Now, you'll notice 2 microphones up here, so we want to be able to hear you, and we want to have anybody watching live stream, to be able to hear you as well. So
we're being taped, huh?
yes, we are.
Hi, Mom.
So yes, so please use a mic if you have a question.
And
Don't be shy. We'll affirm you.
We really want to reiterate that don't be that person who says, I don't need a mic. Part of why you do need a mic is for accessibility reasons. Additionally, don't be that person who says, well, this is more of a comment than a question. I will cut your sound. And I mean that. As a poet, I've heard that lots at poetry readings. I just have, no. This is for questions. So we've had the debate portion, and now we really welcome any questions from the audience and also any questions from the live stream as well. So you can come on down to the mic. If you need one of us to bring the mic to you, let us know.
Womp womp.
Okay, are you ready, Ryan?
No.
In Genesis,
Yeah.
in the beginning, God. Okay.
Yeah.
God created the heavens and the earth, and he saw that it was good. Okay? I believe that. That's my belief.
Good.
Okay, I can't prove it, but that's my belief. When suffering happens, I become a Christian agnostic because I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. And I become, they call me a heretic because I'm like, well, where are you, God? What's happening here? And my question for Ryan and David is, if not God, who? If not God, who? And is there any area I love your argumentation, both of yours, because I think, is there any area in there for the tradition of thousands and thousands of years of the existence of God who created a good and loving world? Is there any area in there? And if not, then who or what is responsible for all of this suffering?
Yeah.
And that's my question. Who or what is? And I think that to think about these things is important. But to say, well, that's good advice or that's a good reason for not believing in a God. But I didn't hear that there is a sense of, what if you do? Are you a stupid jerk? You know? And who, if not God, who? And even who is responsible for, or what is responsible for all of this suffering?
Yeah.
And
I guess I should go first. I don't know if
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay, so let me just set the record straight. No, you're not a stupid... Well, you might be a stupid jerk, but I don't think there's a necessary relationship between believing and that. That could just be unrelated. Because there's, no, I don't think believing in a God makes someone stupid or unintelligent. I think there's evidence for God. I just don't think it's as strong as the evidence of God's absence. This particular God, and I want to keep clarifying that we're talking about this particular God. If not God, then what? I don't know, but I don't know that I have to know. I mean, if I start off by saying, because otherwise we're sort of stuck with an argument from ignorance, where it's like, I don't know what is there, so there must be this thing there. Which would be an argument from ignorance. And I don't want to go there. I would rather just say, I really don't know. I think there are a number of possibilities of what is there. I would also follow up by saying, if you find it therapeutic to believe in God, if it's therapeutically helpful, then do it. I mean, But just don't mistake what is therapeutically beneficial with what is true. Those are different things. And so if you find it personally therapeutic to believe in God, that doesn't necessarily give you the right to enforce that upon other people because you find it personally therapeutic. And the last point that I'll make is about who causes all this suffering. The terrifying thing is, if God exists, God causes a lot of it indirectly. And that's a terrifying thing. And one of the reasons I'm writing a book or stuff about dissonant theodicy is I think we need to take up the biblical tradition of accusation against God. If you're a Christian or a Jew, and Jews do this much better than Christians, I think, you should be able to say, God, you're wrong. This was wrong of you. Because that's in the Bible a lot. But Christians, for some reason, are completely unallowed to do it. Even Jesus on the cross said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet, if you go into a church and cry out like that against God, oftentimes you're going to be looked at as a heretic, which is odd because you're literally quoting Jesus, who is quoting the psalmist. So I think there's another piece of this. Maybe God is responsible, and maybe we need to call God into account for that. Maybe someone else is responsible, or maybe it's just dumb luck. I don't have the answer to where it comes from. I just think that it is there is evidence against the proposition this particular God exists.
Thank you. I'm with you on much of that. In each of the traditions of which I'm most familiar with, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is a group of journeyers or believers in those traditions who are somehow led to the mystical, or led to the mystical traditions, mystical arts, understanding, and mystical sometimes just gets thrown out there as too deep for me. But actually, these are well-thought traditions. Many things have been written down. The Coppola, for Christianity, John of the Cross, Teresa of Lisieux. There are many people who have an experience or share their experience of the transcendent or divine in their way, and it's limited by language and circumstance and time, etc. And yet there is this clear arc, at least for the Abrahamic faith, that God is on the side of the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. God is on the side of the weak and the vulnerable. So if you're hedging your bets and you're saying, there's probably a God, then you better be on the side of the poor, widow, orphan, and stranger. If you're hedging your bets and saying, pardon this expression, this is a philosophical thing, the wager it's called. If you're hedging your bet that there is not a God, then how come you do this, that, or the other thing, whatever it is that you do, for good or for ill? And so I think you're onto something, Ryan, this idea of the tradition of dialogue. It's a very Jewish thing, in Hebrew scriptures, where you give God a hard time. I know it's not very Christian. We're kind of like polite. But read some of the Psalms. God, where the heck are you? Why have you abandoned me? The Psalms of abandonment. Because God, at least in this tradition, the Abrahamic faith, God wants to be in dialogue. And so where is God when pain happens? The tradition teaches, and I think correctly, that God is with those who are suffering. God is crying with the hurt or killed children. God is crying in terms of the victims of war. The rabbis teach, the famous phrase in Exodus where Miriam sings, "The Lord has triumphed and has cast the horse and rider into the sea and killed the Egyptians," on the other side of the Red Sea. And the rabbis teach, but wait a minute, the Egyptians were my children too. So that tradition is powerful, that God is on the side of the oppressed and the vulnerable. And so can we have a conversation with God? The tradition, I'm almost done, the tradition challenges us, at least the Jewish tradition does, and by extension, the Jesus tradition does. I mean, I know we've been influenced a lot by Greco-Roman thought and politeness and all this kind of thing, and Puritanism in this country. That was a mouthful. But anyway, getting back, to Genesis, what does God do to the serpent? Serpent is a symbolic figure, of course, but after the serpent tricks the two characters, you know, Aish and Aisha, we call them Adam and Eve. You know, what does God do? God talks. God dialogues with evil. Doesn't just zap them and say, get out of here. Unfortunately, there are consequences, so Aish and Aisha have to leave the garden. But notice how God talks. Abraham bargains with God. I love this, one of my favorite things. What about if there were only 10 people in Sodom? What if there were only 5, you know? Somehow we think it's indecorous or impolite or even rude to try and bargain with God. But in a semi-nomadic culture, it was not rude. It was what you would do. And so maybe we can recapture some of that. And I guess the final thing is, I'm sorry, I didn't know your name.
Alice.
What's that?
Sister Alice Schwartz.
Oh, sister. Oh, okay. No wonder. It's such a good question. You know, the bottom line is humans get it wrong a lot. Not just a little, but a lot. And so at our best, we produce goodness and beauty and truth and unity. At our worst, we're violent and we're killers in the name of God. And here we are. What are you going to be? Okay.
Thank you. I think we really have only a couple of minutes. Can we take, is there any other audience
15.
member with a question?
15.
Oh, we have some time. Okay, so any other questions from an audience member? Thank you.
Come on down.
As a line-
Professor
door
Albanese?
Door 3.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you both for what I think is a good blueprint for a very civilized debate.
Oh,
Very-
what a
very
concept,
controversial
huh?
topic. So thank you for a good blueprint in terms of how
It's
to
not
do
over
that.
yet.
You can choose either of these two questions to the extent you could do it within a minute or less because these are controversial. But it seems that suffering has always been the major bullet point, right? At least in debates that I've been to in terms of what makes it difficult to argue for a God that meets the characteristics of what we're trying to argue for. And of course, the Catholic faith tradition and the broader Judeo-Christian faith tradition has a proposed answer to that. But my two-part question is, number one, how have other faith traditions explained suffering, since it seems to come up almost universally?
It does.
And
you're
then
right.
number two, even within the Catholic faith tradition, we talk about Aquinas. Aquinas was probably very late. 13th century is modern, right? There were like many centuries before him. How did, if at all, the explanation for suffering change over the years, if at all? Like, had there been a different way of explaining suffering a millennium before Aquinas? Did Aquinas have debates with his contemporaries who disagreed with him? To the extent you can do that within 2 minutes or less, go for it. Otherwise, we'll talk offline about it. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, and by the way, we can talk afterwards as well.
Yeah.
I should have said that. We should have said that up front. There's plenty of time. You want to go first or you want me to? Whatever you
Go ahead.
Okay, so there has always been the problem of evil or injustice. Even the Greeks talk about it. Socrates talks about it, especially when arguing with the sophists, who were only concerned with presenting a good, show, if you will, and they were good at rhetoric, etc. And Plato and Socrates say they don't care about, the core of meaning, which is the pursuit of truth, which brings us happiness. But to the point of suffering, it wasn't always as accentuated in the first, let's say, 1,000 years as it is lately. And I think that's it's an overgeneralization, but it's a fair assessment. So with the rise of the monasteries and with the rise of plagues and other kinds of things, people were pretty much just trying to hang on for life. And so there wasn't a whole lot of conversation. Some of the rabbis have written things. Maimonides wrote some, pieces about it, and often defer to Job, that God's ways are not my ways. So it's not really an answer, but it is saying there is a God. We know this God has our best interests in mind. However, we don't get it. And maybe there's some humility in that. Or maybe not. Maybe it's a cop-out. I don't think it's a cop-out, but I can see how someone would say it's just a cop-out. Why don't you try and get to it? And so after, Kant and Kierkegaard, now I'm name dropping, but after certain kinds of philosophers, we've come to a place where we say, we want a God who's just now and ethical and good. And so we're in the middle of it, quite honestly. And I think there's a convincing set of ways to understand God as just in the face of theodicy.
Yeah, so real quickly, other religious worldviews that don't rely on one God, one ultimate power, have a much easier task. Because you could just be like, there's some bad ones out there. And it's easy, right? Some that have like good and bad built in as a balance into the world, right? That could also be a way, or if you don't have any gods in certain variations of Buddhism, right? You could say that suffering is just a sort of expression of longing. So there's a number of ways out there. Within Christianity, I recently wrote a couple articles in a book chapter that deals with probably about 10 different ways of looking at it. I mean, I think there's no less than 20 that I could sort of characterize. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. But some of them go back to what's called an Irenaean way of looking at it, from Irenaeus, the 2nd century apologist, who said that we need suffering, we need even the possibility of evil in order to grow morally. So John Hick takes this up in modern terms and says, well, you can't develop compassion unless there are people who are suffering, because compassion literally means suffering with. How can I develop compassion unless someone is suffering? He calls that the soul-building theodicy. There's the classic free will defense that goes back to Augustine, developed more recently in Alvin Plantinga and others in the more modern times. The free process defense, which is John Polkinghorne. If you are in my problem of evil class, you're like, he's just reading off the weeks from the class. There are only way arguments that say this world is the only way that God could have developed these particular constants. That's why suffering is inevitable, because this is the only way God could have made a world like this where certain things are possible. Christopher Southgate is one of the best authors I know who writes in that, and I can give you more names later. Process theology is a whole different way. Philosophically, it says that God actually is not omnipotent in the way that most people think. God actually cannot coercively do anything. God can only work through persuasion. And that, for a lack of a better term, limits God profoundly and what God can do. A friend of mine, Tom Ord, has written a whole book called God Can't, where he says bad things happen because God can't stop them. And then there's a whole process called skeptical theism, which says, well, we don't know and we shouldn't expect to know because we're humans. I mean, that's a small taste of what's out there. All I can say is I've gone through every single one of them, and I haven't found a single one convincing. I can't explain why I don't find them all convincing, because I only have like a minute. But there are a lot of different ways of approaching this. They're all good. They're all worth looking into. The question is how successful they are. But there's, like I said, at least 20.
Yeah, thank you. I think as a footnote, the reason why it wasn't discussed as much 2,000 years ago, let's say, is because the concept of person, of individual, has developed. Especially with the advent of psychology, which is not to say that people didn't think of themselves as individuals. They did, but it was always kind of this person in community or a person in context, and quite frankly, we actually think we're autonomous and independent and free in ways that we're probably not.
We might
think that's what you were
overemphasize
getting at.
individuality.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Only one? Come on.
You can stay after, of course.
Here's my problem with God. Why original sin? I don't get it.
Oh, are you on my side, or? No, I'm just joking. Yeah.
Well, I'm on your side for that.
Yeah.
And I'm on another side
Yeah.
since
Yeah.
I'm a Christian. So, but I don't know how to put those
Yeah.
two together.
I don't. Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, so here's the thing about original sin. Like, it depends on what we mean by it. So first, if you're talking about Augustinian original sin, where every baby is born with the guilt that they inherited from Adam, yeah, that's messed up. And then you have to be baptized, be cleansed of that guilt, but sort of the root of it still causes you to do bad things, and so you're inevitably going to be a bad person. I actually heard someone say to me once, a baby cries for their mother's milk because they're selfish. And I was like, this was a Catholic friend of mine, and I was like, Or they're hungry. Like, I mean, that could also be a thing. Or they love their mother. It's like such a negative outlook. I don't always like Augustine. He's smarter than me, but I don't always like him. But here's the thing about original sin that's problematic. It is predicated upon two really strange ideas. One, that there was a human race that clearly existed, and that somehow one person or two people in that race made a mistake that somehow infected the rest of them, if you read it that way. Scientifically, that's not tenable. I don't know how you get there scientifically. It doesn't quite work. Once you accept the theory of evolution, I don't know what original sin looks like anymore. Every tendency that we have toward genocide, toward selfishness, all of that is an evolutionary inheritance. That's how I understand it. So like if there is original sin, its roots are non-human, if I could say it that way. The second problem is it suggests that somehow we could all be punished for what someone else has done. And that doesn't make any sense to me either. So personally, when I was still a practicing Christian, I just said, I went the Eastern Orthodox route and said, I think original sin, as in the Augustinian sense, doesn't make any sense, and I jettisoned it. Said, I just don't think we can hold on to it anymore. So I just got rid of it. Fixed a lot of problems for me. But now look where I am, so, who knows?
So the insight, if you will, of original sin is that our actions affect others. And whether or not, we interpreted that too literally or graphically as a mark and all this kind of thing, especially in the Middle Ages, that's a whole other conversation as well. But there is something to the conviction that what we do makes a difference in history. And so, for example, Native Americans say whatever choice you make, some Native American tribes, I shouldn't overgeneralize, say think of the seventh generation. How will your choices or actions affect the seventh generation? That's in a positive way. Christianity through Augustine, unfortunately, kind of focused more on the negative way. So your action or supposed actions of disobedience also affect others. Someone once said to me, original sin is the only doctrine that needs no proof, okay? Because if you look around, people are just naughty, all right? They misbehave. But I would say that original blessing also does not need proof. That there are people who do extraordinary things, and I don't know why they do it. If left to our own devices, the place would be a mess. The planet would be a mess, but somehow people keep rising up and doing good. Somehow people keep rising up and helping others. And they're not doing it out of fear that some God is going to strike them dead with a lightning bolt. They're doing it because they care, or they as you said, compassio, they have compassion. My conundrum is, I have focused for decades in my life on why there is a problem of evil or bad things, when it's equally as astonishing, why is there so much good in the world? And why do people do so much good? Because if left to our own devices, as I say, a lot of people would be really not so good. And this is not my idea. It's Harold Kushner, a rabbi who wrote a book, 20, 30 years ago, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And he doesn't say why, he says when. And ultimately is, when bad things happen to good people, what are you going to do about it? How's that for a little inclusio? I finished my own thing there. Okay. Oh, we have to officially sit there.
Oh, yeah.
For the tape, for the videotape. Joe.
Wonderful, very beautifully civil way.
Oh, wow.
I want to remind folks to take a survey using the QR code that you see above. You might also see it on your pamphlets. You can take a survey regarding this program. We're really grateful for everyone here. I'm going to pass the mic to my co-moderator for the special thanks.
All right.
You said pass the mic? I thought you were passing the basket. What do you mean? Only kidding, only kidding.
So here we are. Then please, yes, use the QR code. Thank you, Carla, my co-moderator. There's so many people to thank. I want to thank President Crosby and Provost Bartlett, Father Joe for the opening. Where did Father Joe
He's over
go?
there.
There you go.
He's hiding.
And then a lot of IT. If you notice, this is pretty complicated setup. We have a live stream, we have multiple mics, and we have QR codes, and this really went off without a hitch, thanks to Ron Lonecker, our Director of Special Projects, and Joshua Gonzalez. And then we also have Brandon Hutchinson and Michaela Ganshorn. And of course, our debaters. Thank you so much for being here and for spending the time and all the knowledge and wisdom, and for, of course, Ryan, the preparation and bringing this together.
Yeah,
and for
he did a
everybody.
lot of work. I got an email almost every week, updating, so it was, thank you
Speaking
for that.
of the emails, I did search my email for something, and I just realized now what the amount of the thread was just so long. So yeah, a lot of work went into this.
But
so
I didn't know what he was going to say, and he didn't know what I was going to say, so
That is true.
I
There's
appreciate
nothing like that.
the freedom in that, so thank you.
And also, one of the most important parts is the audience. Thank you so much for coming and being here. Okay, so please use the QR code. Okay,
Y'all
thank you
come
for
back to
attending.
here?